The Echoes in the Abandoned Mill. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I'm 32, and I work as an archivist for the State Historical Society. My life is usually spent surrounded by the quiet rustle of old documents, the faint must of aging paper, and the soft glow of fluorescent lights in an otherwise silent office. I keep lists, catalog items, cross-check dates, an orderly world, predictable and calm. Which is why what happened in the Cascades felt like stepping into an entirely different reality, one governed by patterns I could not rationalize. The project began innocuously. A grant had been approved to document early 20th century logging operations within the Olympic National Forest section of the Cascades. I was to survey and photograph remnants of old mill sites, map foundations, and record industrial machinery before they were lost to time and nature. The Blackwood Mill was the centerpiece of this project. Its coordinates barely registered on modern maps. The nearest town, Blackwood's Hollow, consisted of a scattering of weathered cabins, a general store that seemed perpetually half-closed, and locals who eyed outsiders with a mix of suspicion and indifference. Cell service was non-existent, and even the main forest roads thinned into dirt trails that disappeared under the canopy. On arrival, the atmosphere was immediately unusual. The residents whispered of the echoes in the mill, not literal echoes of sound, but lingering presences that seemed to haunt the site. One old man at the general store told me in a low voice, "If you value your mind, you don't stay after sundown." I nodded politely, attributing it to small-town superstition. Yet, the way the community instinctively diverted its gaze toward the dense tree line planted a seed of unease that would grow over the coming days. I began my survey methodically, cataloging rusted machinery, collapsing foundations, and scattered tools. The mill itself was an imposing structure, half claimed by forest undergrowth, steel beams warped and splintered, wooden floors sagging under decades of neglect. At first, everything appeared consistent with ordinary abandonment, decay, overgrowth, rust. But then subtle irregularities emerged. The old mill ledgers I had retrieved from the state archive showed anomalies. Weekly timber payloads would suddenly drop to zero for periods of 2 to 3 weeks, then spike inexplicably. Notes in the margins, cryptic abbreviations, did not match the company's known reporting style. I initially attributed this to clerical errors, lost paperwork, or poor bookkeeping. But patterns continued. The first concrete, undeniable evidence came unexpectedly. Beneath a partially collapsed section of the mill office, I discovered a mildewed wooden box. Inside were bound records, medical documents that, at first glance, made no sense. They were not millworker logs. They contained patient charts from an asylum that, as far as public records indicated, had never existed in this area. The charts documented experiments labeled vaguely as environmental adaptation trials, including metrics on stamina, lung capacity, and neurological response. Alongside the records were crude photographs, restrained subjects, humanoid but grotesquely altered, wires attached to limbs, eyes wide and panicked. Audio recordings on deteriorated tape reels contained shrill, distorted screams, followed by the calm, clinical voice of a doctor discussing procedural outcomes. The screams did not sound human. Piecing this together was unnerving. I cross-referenced names from the medical records with historical missing persons data. The dates matched gaps in census and employment records for the region, reinforcing a conclusion that official archives had deliberately omitted these people. I began cataloging the materials carefully, aware that physical preservation also meant security. I copied what I could onto a secure hard drive, taking photographs of the documents, tapes, and photographs. Each item added weight to a growing realization. This was not mere industrial neglect. Blackwood Mill had been a site of systemic human experimentation, hidden beneath the veneer of forestry operations. As I continued my work, early warnings became personal. On my second day, a local ranger stopped by. His questions were polite but probing. Why was I there exactly? And did I know the mill's history? He recommended I leave immediately, citing safety concerns. I noted that his body language suggested more than mere protocol. There was an underlying urgency that bordered on fear. Later, I noticed I was being watched along the trail into the forest. Shadowy figures appeared behind trees at distances that could be coincidence, but they were consistently positioned to monitor my movements, retreating silently when I noticed them. On the fourth day, I descended into the underground tunnels that ran beneath the mill. The entry point was narrow, partially blocked by debris. The faint guttural sounds I had been tracing grew louder as I moved deeper. My flashlight illuminated cages embedded into the rock walls. In one, a humanoid figure shifted. It was emaciated, limbs elongated unnaturally, eyes reflecting a desperate, animal-like intelligence. When it lunged, rattling the rusted bars, I froze. The creature emitted a wordless plea, something entirely human yet profoundly alien. My escape was instinctual. I fled the tunnels, adrenaline flooding my system, with the creature's cries echoing behind me. I made it back to my vehicle and drove until the outlines of Blackwood's Hollow were swallowed by darkness. Institutional fallout followed quickly. I reported my findings to the State Historical Society, providing copies of all physical and digital evidence. Within days, the FBI had launched a full investigation. Missing persons files spanning decades were reopened. Blackwood Mill was sealed as a biohazard and historical crime scene. Arrests were made, and surviving personnel connected to the experiments faced charges. The federal investigation exposed an unbroken chain of concealment spanning forestry officials, local authorities, and medical professionals complicit in suppressing the truth. Yet even as official reports were released, portions of the site remained unexplored. Underground tunnels and structural cavities that no team had fully accessed. The lingering horror is impossible to escape. Blackwood Mill may be contained officially, but new reports emerge periodically. Hikers vanishing in the same remote section of the Cascades, sometimes with belongings found near the old mill trails. The concept of environmental adaptation trials seems not entirely confined to history. It is a question that haunts me daily. What else might be ongoing in those forests, hidden from oversight, shielded by the dense isolation that makes investigation almost impossible? I've returned to my normal life as an archivist, but the images, recordings, and patterns I witnessed at Blackwood Mill have not left me. In quiet moments, the echoes of the mill, the screams, the shifting forms, the unblinking eyes return. There is a cautionary lesson here. Sometimes the most isolated locations hide crimes so meticulously, so quietly, that the human mind almost wishes to disbelieve them. Yet disbelief does not erase reality. And while institutions can investigate and prosecute, the silent dread, the knowledge that some evils are designed to survive observation, remains an inescapable part of the Cascades. The Green Mist of Cedar Creek. My name is Marcus Thorne. I'm 48 years old, and at the time this happened, I had been working as a hydrologist for the Department of Fish and Wildlife for just over 20 years. My job was not investigative in the dramatic sense. Most of my days were predictable. I monitored river systems, logged dissolved oxygen levels, checked nitrate concentrations, and filed compliance reports that almost no one read unless something went wrong. I worked alone most of the time. Remote sites were normal. Isolation was part of the profession. Before Cedar Creek, nothing in my career suggested that water could be weaponized in a way that didn't leave a clear paper trail. The trigger event came in the form of 3 reports submitted within the same month. All 3 were flagged by the same regional biologist. Fish kills along a minor tributary in the Cascades foothills. Stunted riparian vegetation inconsistent with seasonal drought. And, most concerning, reports of small mammals behaving aggressively toward humans. The location was Cedar Creek, near the southern edge of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. Normally, these kinds of anomalies get attributed to runoff, temperature spikes, or disease. But the data didn't line up. The kills weren't random. They were clustered, repeating downstream at consistent intervals. I was assigned to conduct field sampling and prepare an independent assessment. Cedar Creek Junction was the nearest settlement. Calling it a town felt generous. It was a former logging outpost with fewer than 30 permanent residents, most of them elderly. The road in narrowed to a single lane for the last 12 miles. Cell service dropped 5 miles out. The forest pressed close on both sides, dense enough to block light even at midday. What I noticed immediately was the silence. No chainsaws, no dogs, no birds. I checked into the only place offering rooms, a converted bunkhouse run by an older couple who didn't ask questions and didn't volunteer information. When I mentioned the creek, the woman stopped writing and looked up at me. She told me not to go near the old mill downstream. She didn't explain why. The next morning, I began sampling at the upper tributaries. Standard procedure. Temperature, turbidity, pH, everything within expected ranges. The first irregularity appeared 2 miles downstream. Elevated readings in compounds I couldn't immediately identify. My portable spectrometer flagged anomalies that didn't match known agricultural or industrial contaminants. I recalibrated twice. Same result. By late afternoon, I noticed the air itself felt wrong. Heavy. There was a faint sweetness to it, like overripe fruit mixed with something metallic. After a few hours, I developed a headache and mild nausea. I logged it as possible dehydration and continued. At dusk, I saw the mist. It wasn't fog. Fog disperses with airflow. This didn't. It rose directly from the creek bed, low and concentrated, glowing faintly green as the light faded. It moved slowly, hugging the water, curling around exposed roots and rocks. When it touched vegetation, leaves browned within minutes. I recorded video and collected air samples, keeping my distance. Over the next 2 days, patterns began to emerge. Fish kills always followed nights when the mist was visible. Wildlife aggression reports aligned with downstream exposure zones. Dates in my data overlapped with older incident reports buried in regional archives under unrelated categories. Repeated names appeared in those records. The same environmental compliance officer signing off on inspections in the 1970s. The same mill listed as inactive despite power draw logs indicating otherwise. The Cedar Creek lumber mill sat downstream, officially abandoned since 1981. Locals avoided it. When I asked about it directly, conversations ended. On the 3rd night, I returned to the creek after sunset to observe the mist again. Standing alone, 50 yards from the water, I had the distinct sensation of being watched. The forest was completely still. No insects, no wind. The mist rose higher than before, and my monitoring equipment began to alarm. I left. The following morning, I hiked to the mill. From the outside, it looked exactly like an abandoned site should. Collapsed roofing, rusted equipment, overgrowth reclaiming access roads. But inside, past a locked interior door forced open years earlier, the air changed immediately. There were pipes, recent ones, not lumber equipment, chemical processing lines disguised beneath rusted housings, power cables running underground, vats still warm to the touch. I found a locked office. Inside were file cabinets sealed with federal inventory tags that predated my employment by decades. The files referenced Project Chimera. The documents outlined experimental herbicide and defoliant testing conducted during the Cold War, airborne dispersal trials, aquatic absorption rates, neurological effects on mammals. The goal was ecological denial, rendering environments uninhabitable without overt destruction. Logbooks documented ongoing testing well past the project's supposed termination. Dates matched the fish kills. Handwritten notes described behavioral agitation and increased hostility in exposed wildlife. There were photographs, aerial dispersal diagrams, medical charts tracking symptoms in local populations. The most recent entry was less than 6 months old. As I photographed everything, I noticed the mist inside the mill was thicker. My Geiger counter, something I carried routinely for baseline checks, spiked unexpectedly. I followed a narrow passage behind one of the vats and found a stairwell descending underground. Halfway down, visibility dropped to near zero. The green mist clung to the walls. Breathing became difficult. Then I heard movement. A figure emerged slowly. A man wearing an old hazmat suit, yellowed and cracked, carrying a metal sprayer that looked decades out of date. His movements were unsteady. His eyes, visible through the damaged visor, were bloodshot and unfocused. He told me I wasn't supposed to be there. When he raised the sprayer, I ran. I don't remember making conscious decisions. I remember coughing, my lungs burning, the mist thickening behind me. I burst out of the mill and didn't stop running until I reached my truck. As I drove, I heard shouting behind me, distorted by distance and panic. He kept repeating that I had seen too much. I drove until I crossed a county line and collapsed in a rest area. I reported everything immediately. Within 48 hours, the EPA and CDC established a perimeter around Cedar Creek. Federal agents sealed the mill. Access roads were closed. Residents were relocated under emergency health orders. Official statements cited an unknown ecological hazard. No one publicly acknowledged Project Chimera. I was instructed not to speak about the man in the hazmat suit. No arrest was announced, no identification released. The site remains restricted. The last satellite imagery I reviewed still shows discoloration along the creek. At night, thermal anomalies persist. Whatever was released there never fully dissipated, and as far as I know, no one has confirmed whether the man I encountered was a remnant of the project or proof it never ended. The Cannibal's Cabin of Cascade Forks. I transferred to Cascade County in late autumn, after 22 years in a metropolitan homicide unit. I was 55 and ready for quiet. The sheriff sold it that way. Fewer calls, fewer bodies, mostly search and rescue and property disputes. The Cascades were supposed to slow everything down. Pine air, distance, a place where the days ended early and nothing unexpected happened. I rented a small house 10 miles outside Cascade Forks. The town itself barely qualified as a town. One closed mill, a gas station with limited hours, a post office that shut down at noon, and a diner that served the same 4 plates every day. I learned routines quickly. Coffee at dawn, paperwork until noon, patrols along logging roads in the afternoon, silence after dark. The call came on a Wednesday morning. A deer hunter had walked into the sheriff's office carrying a burlap sack. He didn't sit down. He didn't ask for coffee. He said he'd found something near an old cabin along the North Fork. He emptied the sack on the counter. It was a skull. Not weathered enough to be old, not clean enough to be animal. I recognized the suture lines immediately. Human, male, adult. The hunter said it was half buried near a game trail. He said he'd almost kicked it. He said there were bones scattered farther out, but he didn't go looking. He said the place felt wrong and that he'd left. Cascade Forks had no open missing persons cases, none officially active. The county records clerk confirmed it. The sheriff confirmed it. He told me it was probably transient remains from decades back. Logging accidents, drifters. The woods take people, he said. Always have. I asked for the location. The North Fork was 40 minutes out, past the last maintained road. Cell service died 10 miles in. The forest closed around the truck like a lid. The cabin wasn't marked on any county map. It sat in a low basin near the confluence of two creeks, hidden by alder and rotfall. It wasn't abandoned in the way old structures usually are. It was maintained, cleared paths, fresh axe marks, smoke stains on the flue. Before we reached it, we saw bones. They were arranged, not scattered by animals, set along the perimeter like boundary markers. Long bones, vertebrae, some animal, some not. I'd worked enough scenes to know the difference. Inside the cabin, the smell hit first. Decay layered with iron and something sweet I couldn't place at the time. The interior was small but ordered. Shelves lined with jars, tools hung with care. Traps leaned against one wall, repaired and reused. There was a table in the center with deep scoring marks, the kind made by repeated cutting in the same place. No power, no running water, no signs of recent struggle. Whoever lived here knew what they were doing and had been doing it a long time. We secured the site and called for forensic support. The sheriff hesitated. He asked if that was necessary yet. I told him we already had a human skull and suspected remains. He signed off, but he wasn't pleased. While we waited, I walked the perimeter. The shallow ground behind the cabin had been turned over repeatedly. I probed with a rod and hit resistance less than 2 feet down. Multiple times. We flagged the area and stopped digging. Back in town, I started asking questions. Cascade Forks had fewer than 200 residents left. Most families had been there generations. They didn't like outsiders. They liked investigators even less. Only one person would speak freely. Jed Klein, old prospector, lived alone in a trailer near the river. He said he'd known about the cabin since the 70s, said everyone did. He called the occupant the Hermit of the Forks. Said the man didn't come into town, didn't trade, didn't hunt deer. He don't eat what God provides, Jed said. That was all he'd add. Forensics came back within a week. The skull belonged to a male reported missing in 1986, a hitchhiker last seen near a logging road outside Cascade Forks. Case closed at the time as voluntary disappearance. No follow-up. Excavation behind the cabin revealed more remains, at least 6 individuals. All adult, all male. Cut marks consistent with defleshing. No evidence of scavenging. The bones had been processed. Under the cabin, in the crawlspace, we found a journal. It was bound in oilcloth. The handwriting was neat, consistent. The entries spanned decades, dates, weather notes, inventory lists, and then the hunts. He didn't call them murders. He called them acquisitions. He wrote about watching trails, about selecting individuals who wouldn't be missed. Drifters, hunters. A local once when supplies were low. He detailed preparation methods, storage, preservation. There was pride in the writing, a sense of order. He signed entries with a single initial, H. I forwarded copies to the state. The sheriff told me to slow down. said this was getting bigger than necessary. He reminded me that tourism, what little remained, mattered. He suggested we classify it as historical and close it pending further review. That was the first time I realized the resistance wasn't ignorance, it was fear. I pulled old records. Missing persons dismissed quickly. Reports marked incomplete. Tips not logged. There was a pattern, names recurring. Locations near the North Fork. All brushed aside by previous administrations. The sheriff before the current one had held the position for 20 years. We tracked H's movements through the journal, supply caches, seasonal patterns. A note about the cold rooms led us deeper into the forest, to a cave system marked by old survey stakes. Inside, the air was stagnant. The smell was unmistakable. We found a larder, shelving built into the rock, wrapped parcels, bone saws worn down to nubs. We were cataloging when we heard movement. A sound deeper in the cave, then a voice, low, close. He came at us fast, not old, not frail, broad-shouldered, bare arms corded with muscle, a rusted cleaver in his hand. His eyes were focused, not wild, calculating. He wounded one deputy before we dropped him. It took 3 of us to restrain him. He never spoke, not then, not later. His name was Horace Blackwood, born locally, no birth certificate filed, no social security number, no medical records. He'd existed between systems his entire life. Federal agents arrived within days. The site was sealed. The sheriff retired early. Charges were filed. The press called it a shock, but it wasn't. People had known. They'd warned hikers quietly, avoided the forks, looked the other way. Authority had failed because it was easier. The cabin was burned, officially decontaminated. The forest grew back. Sometimes on patrol, I still take the road out there. The trailhead is gone. The creek sounds the same. What stays with me isn't Blackwood. It's how long it took for anyone to look. And how many places like Cascade Forks exist, where silence does the work of evil better than any accomplice ever could. The Shifting Sands of Rattlesnake Ridge. I'm Dr. Lena Hansen, 40, a geological surveyor with a private energy firm. My expertise lies in analyzing seismic data and rock formations, mapping underground structures, and identifying potential resource deposits. Until the summer of 2018, my work was largely routine: measurements, field surveys, and lab analysis. My daily life was methodical: waking before dawn, checking data logs, inspecting drill sites, and compiling reports. I spent long stretches in the field, alone or with small teams, accustomed to the isolation that comes with remote geological research. It was precise work, grounded in empirical evidence. I had no illusions of mystery or speculation. Anomalies are usually explained by soil composition, fault lines, or measurement errors. That changed with a sequence of seismic readings from the eastern Cascades, particularly a sparsely populated region known locally as Rattlesnake Ridge. The anomalies first appeared as slight deviations in our gravimeter readings, recorded by sensors we had deployed to study normal bedrock density. Initially, I dismissed them as instrumental noise, but over several weeks the patterns became undeniable. Gravimeters fluctuated dramatically, impossible for conventional geology. Local residents, few as they were, only offered vague warnings. Echo Pass, the nearest town, was a quiet cluster of weathered homes and dusty general stores. People there were polite but distant, and their statements were uniform. The ridge has always been strange. That repetition, that flat acceptance of the abnormal, was unsettling in itself. The formal trigger came in the form of an internal request. Our firm had allocated additional funding for a focused survey on the ridge, citing unexplained subsurface activity. I was assigned lead investigator. I packed equipment, including a portable core drill, gravimeters, ground-penetrating radar, and spectrometry kits, and assembled a small field team. The drive into the area was long, the roads narrow, winding, often overgrown. GPS coverage dropped intermittently, and by the time we reached the base of Rattlesnake Ridge, the valley had emptied of any modern markers. No cell phone towers, no power lines, no visible traffic. The surrounding peaks rose steeply, and a fog often settled low, obscuring ridges entirely. The silence was profound. Early irregularities appeared within hours of arrival. Our GPR scans did not detect solid bedrock. Instead, shifting subterranean caverns seemed to reconfigure almost daily. Gravity readings fluctuated unpredictably, sometimes reversing briefly, then normalizing without warning. The air carried a persistent, low-frequency hum. At first, it was subtle, vibrating through the steel frames of our equipment. Soon, it resonated in our bones. Several team members reported nausea or disorientation. I attributed it to fatigue, though the readings suggested an external source. Pattern recognition emerged as we cataloged data over successive days. The anomalies coincided with minor sinkholes, subtle cracks forming in what should have been solid rock. Core samples collected from multiple points were inconsistent. Some drills returned ordinary sediment, while others passed through porous, gelatinous layers that defied known classification. Gravimetry readings suggested fluctuating mass beneath the ridge. Overlaying these maps with historic records from local libraries revealed references to the ridge's instability stretching back over a century. Several entries mentioned breathing ground and inexplicable tremors. The first hard evidence arrived during a deep core extraction. The drill pierced an unexpected layer of dense material. Initially, we assumed mineral concretions, but the sample's reaction was immediate. It deformed under heat and emitted faint biological markers. Laboratory analysis later revealed amino acid sequences unlike anything on Earth. The implications were extraordinary. It was no simple geological anomaly. We were observing an organic substrate embedded in the bedrock itself. Around this time, I explored a nearby abandoned homestead on Echo Pass. Its attic contained journals from a 19th-century geologist, Samuel Trenholm, who had studied the ridge. His handwriting, careful at first, became increasingly erratic. He described similar phenomena: seismic irregularities, low hums, and whispers from beneath the earth. Sketches in the journals depicted massive, segmented underground forms he theorized were responsible. His final entry ended mid-sentence, mentioning the earth opening its maw, and abrupt cessation of notes thereafter. Institutional resistance began subtly. When I attempted to share preliminary findings with the State Geological Survey, my communications were met with delays and vague reassurances. Funding for the deeper survey was questioned, with internal memos advising caution about unverified and potentially destabilizing claims. One regional official hinted, off the record, that continued exploration could attract scrutiny from federal agencies, yet provided no guidance. Attempts to file formal incident reports on the biological core samples were similarly stonewalled. Escalation intensified when a massive sinkhole opened directly beneath our primary monitoring station. The ground rippled as if liquid, an impossibility given the bedrock beneath. Peering into the abyss, I witnessed rhythmic pulsing from the depths. A resonant groan emanated from below, vibrating through the ridge. Then, a section of the wall collapsed, revealing a colossal maw-like structure with crystalline teeth arranged in geometric rows. The material was clearly organic, capable of flexing and contracting like living tissue. The air smelled of sulfur, sweet yet suffocating. The force of suction nearly dislodged my boots. Immediate evacuation became imperative. I stumbled backward, leaving behind millions in equipment, and our team retreated down the ridge, shaken and silent. Critical evidence consisted of the biological core samples, Trenholm's journals, and continuous seismic logs from our GPR and gravimeters. Each dataset independently confirmed anomalies. Cross-referencing historic accounts with modern measurements revealed patterns. The ridge's underground structures had been consistently mischaracterized, and early warnings by Trenholm were ignored or lost in the bureaucratic record. Life-threatening confrontation occurred indirectly. On the second day after the sinkhole event, I noticed a series of footprints near our abandoned field camp that did not match our team or known wildlife. Attempts to investigate were complicated by sudden fog, fluctuating gravity readings, and equipment failures. The presence suggested either monitoring by unknown personnel or an organized suppression effort. The ridge itself, unstable and dangerous, became a natural barrier. Escape and intervention required immediate coordination. We withdrew to Echo Pass, contacting the firm remotely. The company ordered a full evacuation. Local authorities issued no specific guidance but permitted our extraction, acknowledging the ridge as geologically unstable. The combination of direct environmental threat and potential regulatory liability dictated our withdrawal. Aftermath and legal fallout unfolded predictably. Our firm ceased operations in the area. Government geological agencies published alerts about unprecedented seismic activity, but avoided reference to the biological anomalies. Trenholm's journals were archived quietly. Attempts to secure them for peer review were restricted by local historical societies, citing preservation concerns. No public disclosures clarified the extent of the findings. The lingering final horror is psychological and scientific. Something ancient, enormous, and sentient resides beneath Rattlesnake Ridge. Its breathing is real. Its scale is beyond comprehension, and its periodic activity appears to have persisted for centuries. What we observed may only represent a fraction of its existence. The ridge's organic structures remain undocumented officially, yet fully capable of movement and response. There is no assurance it will remain dormant. Even now, satellite readings show microtremors in patterns that do not conform to tectonic models. Gravimeters still detect mass fluctuations under the ridge. The possibility that the entity could awaken fully, consuming everything above it, is a conclusion supported not by fear or folklore, but by the data itself. My field notes, core samples, and digital logs remain in secure storage, awaiting further scientific review. The ridge continues to shift. I do not know if it sleeps or merely waits. The Lullaby of Lost Lake. I'm Dr. Evelyn Reed. I was 38 at the time, licensed, board-certified, and 14 years into a career that had trained me to distrust coincidence. My work focused on childhood trauma and repressed memory, mostly urban cases, mostly predictable patterns, clinics, intake forms, carefully managed silences. Lost Lake was not supposed to fit into that life. Before the referrals, my days were repetitive in the way I'd come to rely on. I arrived at the clinic at 7:30 a.m., reviewed case notes, conducted structured play therapy, documented progress, and returned home to a quiet apartment where nothing followed me. Children's fears, no matter how severe, had causes: abuse, neglect, accidents. Even the most elaborate delusions eventually revealed their origins. That belief ended with 3 referral packets delivered within the same week. They came from different counties, different general practitioners, different social workers, yet the symptom descriptions were nearly identical. Children under 10, no known trauma history, sudden onset night terrors, sleepwalking, vocalizations during sleep described as humming or singing. All of them lived within 50 miles of a place I had never heard of before, Lost Lake. The trigger event wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. One of the referring pediatricians attached a handwritten note asking if I'd be willing to conduct on-site evaluations due to the family's reluctance to travel. He added a line I initially dismissed as stress. They keep mentioning the lake, all of them. I accepted the assignment because clustering matters. Patterns demand proximity. Lost Lake sits deep inside the North Cascades National Park, reachable only by a single unmaintained road that turns to gravel miles before the final ascent. There is no town in the conventional sense, just a scattering of seasonal cabins, a ranger outpost closed 8 months of the year, and a population that rarely exceeds 24 during winter. The remoteness was immediate. Cell service dropped 15 miles out. Radio stations faded into static. Even the forest felt denser than I expected, old growth pressing close, absorbing sound. When I arrived, there was no one waiting, no signage, just water. Lost Lake is glacial-fed, unnaturally clear, and ringed by steep rock faces that prevent easy access to its shore. The silence there felt structural, not peaceful, as if sound had been deliberately removed. Early irregularities surfaced within hours. The first parent I met spoke only in generalities. The second refused to let their child draw near the windows after sunset. When I asked about the lake, responses shifted. Conversations ended. One man told me, without elaboration, that some things were better not investigated. At the ranger station, a single seasonal officer, Deputy Ranger Paul Henrik, confirmed the reports but discouraged my involvement. He suggested the children were feeding off one another's fears. When I asked how children from families who never interacted were doing that, he said nothing. He avoided eye contact. His logbooks were incomplete. The children themselves were cooperative, too cooperative. During initial sessions, every child described the same figure. They didn't use the same words, but the imagery overlapped with disturbing precision. A woman in the water, beautiful, singing, waiting. They drew her independently, long hair, pale light surrounding her. Arms extended from beneath the surface. They hummed the same melody. I recorded it, compared the audio files. The pitch varied slightly, but the structure was consistent, modal, archaic, not aligned with any modern lullaby cataloged in my references. Pattern recognition escalated quickly. Dates of symptom onset correlated with moon cycles. Sleepwalking episodes always moved toward the lake. None of the children had ever been swimming there. Several had never been allowed near it. The air around Lost Lake carried a sensation I can only describe clinically as disorientation. A faint, high-frequency hum sat just below conscious hearing, producing headaches and mild vertigo during prolonged exposure. My equipment registered nothing abnormal. The first hard evidence came from history. I accessed regional archives in a nearby county seat. Records from the late 1800s documented a small isolationist commune that settled near Lost Lake. The commune collapsed during an epidemic described vaguely as a wasting illness. Official reports blamed contaminated water. Buried deeper were personal journals confiscated during the dissolution. One belonged to a man identified as the group's spiritual leader. He wrote of children, wandering at night, and voices rising from the water. He described his daughter, Ilara, gifted with an unnatural singing voice, who vanished into the lake during the final weeks of the outbreak. No body was recovered. The journals ended abruptly. Institutional resistance followed immediately after I requested copies. The archivist hesitated. A county official intervened, citing preservation concerns. When I pressed, my access was revoked entirely. Back at Lost Lake, Deputy Ranger Henrik informed me that further research would require federal clearance due to park jurisdiction. His tone wasn't defensive. It was resigned. The escalation into personal danger was subtle. I noticed my cabin door unlocked after returning from sessions. My notes were rearranged. The underwater diver footage, sent to me anonymously by a local hobbyist, was briefly confiscated by park authorities for safety review. The footage mattered. It showed a submerged stone structure near the lake's deepest point, something no survey maps acknowledged. Bioluminescent formations pulsed rhythmically around it. At one point, a silhouette moved through the frame. Human in shape, fluid in motion, singing distorted through water. The critical confrontation occurred during my final week. I was observing Lily, the youngest affected child. She began sleepwalking shortly after midnight. I followed at a distance, documenting. As she approached the shoreline, the humming grew louder, not from her but from the lake itself. The surface began to glow. A figure rose slowly, light refracting around a form that should not have existed. Her face was unmistakably human. Her eyes fixed on Lily with something I can only describe as longing. I intervened physically, pulling Lily back. The song broke. The figure receded. I reported everything. The response was swift and absolute. Local authorities dismissed my findings as stress-induced hallucination. My license was reviewed. The footage was classified as inconclusive. The submerged structure was deemed a natural formation. Federal agencies arrived weeks later. Quietly, there were no press releases. The ranger station closed permanently. The cabins were condemned. Officially, nothing was found. The children's symptoms lessened but did not vanish. The lullaby persisted in their dreams. I no longer accept referrals near Lost Lake. The unresolved truth remains beneath the water. And sometimes, even now, I hear the hum when it's quiet enough. Waiting. The Canyon of the Missing Hikers. My name is David Chen. I'm 34 years old, and at the time this happened, I was a search and rescue specialist with the National Park Service, assigned to the Cascades region. My job was routine in the way emergency work often is, long stretches of calm punctuated by brief moments of urgency. Most days were spent maintaining trail familiarity, reviewing past incident reports, running navigation drills, and assisting lost or injured hikers who underestimated the terrain. I took pride in knowing the landscape, the trails, the elevation changes, the places where weather turned suddenly dangerous. I believed, maybe too strongly, that if you respected the land and prepared properly, most situations could be managed. That belief began to erode with the case that brought me into the canyon system locals referred to as the Maw. The trigger was a briefing memo circulated internally after the 7th disappearance in 3 years. 7 hikers, all experienced, all properly equipped, none recovered, no remains, no confirmed injury sites, no dropped gear trails leading outward. The disappearances were spread across seasons, weather conditions, and entry points. The only common denominator was the canyon itself, a remote and deeply cut system within the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest. The memo avoided speculation and framed the situation as terrain-related risk compounded by navigational complexity, but the statistical anomalies were impossible to ignore. I was assigned to lead a renewed search effort after the most recent disappearance, a 41-year-old solo hiker with extensive backcountry experience. His last GPS ping placed him well within the canyon, moving steadily, no signs of distress, then nothing. The maw is difficult to describe unless you've stood at its edge. It's not a single canyon, but a network of narrow gorges that twist back on themselves with sheer walls that block sunlight for most of the day. Sound behaves strangely there. Wind dies abruptly. Footsteps seem absorbed by the rock. The nearest town, Haven, is over an hour away on poorly maintained roads. It consists of a small cluster of homes, a closed school, and a general store that doubles as a post office. Locals there speak carefully. Conversations tend to stop when outsiders enter the room. When my team arrived, the isolation was immediate. Radios worked intermittently. Satellite phones lagged. GPS units lost accuracy as soon as we descended below the canyon rim. At first, these issues were logged as expected interference caused by terrain. But over the next 2 days, patterns emerged that didn't fit standard explanations. We found campsites that appeared fully intact, tents pitched properly, food stored, boots lined up just outside. In one case, a cooking pot was still balanced on cold stones, half filled with water. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no drag marks, no tracks leading away from the site. It was as if the occupants had stepped aside briefly and never returned. During interviews in Haven, an older resident told me, without prompting, that the canyon doesn't always let people leave. He refused to elaborate. Another resident warned us not to follow voices if we heard them echoing from side passages. When I asked him directly what he meant, he said, "You'll think it's your people. It isn't." These comments were noted but officially categorized as local folklore. The first stage of pattern recognition came from records review. I requested archived incident files going back as far as possible. Buried in unindexed boxes was a thin folder dated 1957. It detailed 3 disappearances in the same canyon system. The language mirrored modern reports almost exactly. Sudden loss of contact, intact campsites, no remains. Attached was a hand-drawn sketch by a ranger who had been part of the search. The drawing showed a geometric symbol carved into stone. The ranger who drew it was listed as missing 2 months later. That symbol surfaced again during our physical search. On the 5th day, one of our grid teams located a shallow alcove hidden behind a rockfall. Inside, carved faintly into the stone, was the same symbol. It wasn't consistent with known indigenous petroglyphs in the area. The lines were precise, almost clinical. No weathering pattern suggested recent carving, but no record existed of its origin. We photographed it, logged coordinates, and marked the site for follow-up. The first undeniable hard evidence came from a camera. One of the missing hikers had carried a digital camera separate from his phone. It was found on a ledge several hundred yards from his last known location. The device was damaged but recoverable. The final images showed a progression: canyon walls, a narrow passage, then something that did not resemble any geological formation I could identify. The image was distorted, as if taken through a warped lens. A vertical shimmer occupied the center of the frame, bending the background around it. The final frame was partially blacked out, metadata corrupted, timestamp frozen. When I submitted these findings, the response from superiors was immediate, but not supportive. Requests for extended search authorization were delayed. Access to older files became restricted. A regional administrator advised me, off record, to focus on closure, not questions. When I pushed back, I was reminded that speculation could cause public panic and legal complications. Surveillance awareness crept in gradually. I noticed unfamiliar vehicles parked near our staging area. Radios emitted brief bursts of static that sounded almost like voices, then went silent. One night, while stationed alone at a monitoring point, the forest went completely quiet. No insects, no wind. That silence lasted long enough for me to note it consciously before it ended all at once. The critical discovery happened during what was meant to be a final sweep. Deep within the canyon, beyond mapped trails, we entered a clearing that should not have existed. The ground was perfectly circular and bare, vegetation ending sharply at its boundary. In the center, the air appeared distorted, like heat haze without heat. Instruments failed simultaneously. Compasses spun, GPS units went blank, radios activated without input. Then the audio began. My radio filled with overlapping voices. They were fragmented, distorted, but unmistakably human. Some were calling names, others were pleading for help. One voice used my name. The source was not traceable. It did not match any active frequency. Within the distortion, a shape formed, a human outline, translucent, unstable. It raised an arm, slowly, as if signaling. I felt a physical sensation, not pain, but pressure, like being pulled forward against my will. Training took over. I ordered a retreat. The moment we crossed the clearing's edge, the radios fell silent. We evacuated the canyon that day. My formal report described the site as a localized, unidentified environmental anomaly and recommended immediate closure pending federal investigation. The response was swift but limited. I was reassigned within weeks to a different region, officially for stress management. The canyon was closed to the public under the explanation of extreme geological instability. No mention was made of symbols, recordings, or archival correlations. There was no press conference. No task force announced. Several months later, I learned that access to the canyon's deeper sections had been restricted even from internal review teams. Requests for follow-up research were denied. The 1957 file disappeared from the archive system entirely. The official position is that the case is closed, but hikers still vanish in nearby regions. Reports continue, just far enough away to avoid drawing connections. And sometimes, late at night, when radios crackle unexpectedly during routine checks, I remember the voices. The way they didn't sound like echoes at all, more like messages that never finished transmitting. The maw is still there. Quiet, closed, unmarked, and whatever took those hikers has not been recovered, identified, or proven to have stopped. The Flesh Weavers of Foggy Bog. My name is Dr. Alan Thorne. I am 42, and for the past 18 years I have specialized in botany and mycology, with a focus on rare and unusual fungal ecosystems. Most of my work is solitary. I travel to neglected swamps, old-growth forests, and high-altitude bogs to document plant-fungal interactions, catalog species, and collect samples for ecological research. Fieldwork is meticulous, often mundane, and my days are normally quiet. I record growth rates, note humidity variations, and maintain detailed logs of specimen collections. Hazardous environments are familiar, but I had never encountered anything remotely comparable to Foggy Bog. The assignment came as a cluster of reports from amateur naturalists and regional wildlife observers. They all described a recurring, bioluminescent fungal bloom deep in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie section of the Cascades. Initial accounts were vague. Photographs showed faint greenish light in dense mist. Sketches indicated strange geometric patterns, but no firm ecological explanation existed. The consistency of the reports suggested a persistent, unusual biological phenomenon. My university approved a short-term grant to conduct a preliminary survey, primarily for documentation and soil-fungal interaction analysis. The arrival at Foggy Bog was the first sign that ordinary fieldwork procedures would not suffice. The site is situated within a densely forested, low-lying valley, frequently enshrouded in fog, with stagnant waters and soft, treacherous ground. Access requires navigating a narrow Forest Service road that terminates at a dilapidated hunting lodge. The lodge is run by a man named Jedediah, a reclusive trapper whose presence alone is unnerving. He warned me explicitly, never breathe the bog's air after dusk. His eyes were wide, his voice low, and he made no joke of it. Beyond the lodge, there are no roads, no clearings, no signs of recent human activity. Cell service is non-existent, and GPS coverage is unreliable in the dense canopy. The first days were dedicated to ordinary surveying, soil sampling, water chemistry readings, and cataloging plant species. Everything initially appeared consistent with other bog ecosystems. Then subtle irregularities emerged. Atmospheric pressure readings fluctuated in unpredictable ways. The bog's air carried a cloying, sweet odor, unlike typical decaying plant matter. My instruments picked up an unusual energy signature, something I could not calibrate to any known physical phenomenon. At night, my equipment registered minor, localized electromagnetic spikes, and the bioluminescent fungi seemed to respond, pulsing rhythmically, even in areas without apparent substrate changes. It was faint at first, easy to dismiss but consistent. Pattern recognition began over the third and fourth day. The fungi did not grow randomly. They formed precise geometric patterns, intersecting hexagonal and lattice-like structures. Certain areas were densely colonized, others left starkly bare, as if the ecosystem was intentionally constructing networks and voids. I compared these patterns to historical botanical maps and aerial surveys. Most of the documented forest floor irregularities could be explained by typical hydrological flows, but a small section of Foggy Bog consistently defied natural explanation. I cross-referenced survey maps from the 1930s and found a notation labeled "unusual biological activity," accompanied by a sketch of an expansive, web-like network beneath the surface, with small humanoid shapes embedded within. No explanation accompanied the sketch, and the map had been filed and forgotten in a state archive. My first hard evidence occurred on the fifth day. While documenting a particularly dense fungal colony, I encountered the remains of a deer. It appeared partially mummified, yet overgrown with the glowing fungi. The mycelial structures had interlaced with its tissue, forming precise, almost architectural patterns. This was not decomposition in any known sense. The fungal filaments had replaced and restructured parts of the organic material, integrating mammalian cellular matter into the network. I collected samples carefully, noting the exact GPS coordinates, photographing every angle, and recording detailed notes on the structural morphology of the fungal network. The next phase of institutional resistance began unexpectedly. When I transmitted preliminary images and lab analyses back to my university, the research board demanded an immediate explanation. They suggested that any anomalies were likely artifacts of hallucinogenic compounds in the fungi, despite my lack of exposure symptoms. Within 48 hours, my grant was formally revoked, citing unethical research practices and unsubstantiated claims. I was instructed to suspend all fieldwork and refrain from publication. No one questioned the validity of my instruments or the consistency of my photographic records. Instead, authority attempted to preemptively discredit the findings. The silence from federal or regional agencies was also telling. No one acknowledged my reports, and repeated calls to the Forest Service were deflected. The escalation into personal danger occurred on the 7th day, during a nocturnal survey. I returned to an area of high fungal density after sunset to document luminescence patterns. As I descended into the bog, the odor intensified, inducing mild nausea and disorientation. My headlamp illuminated pulsating fungal structures intertwined with thick, low-hanging mist. Movement at the periphery of vision suggested the presence of entities within the fog. For several minutes I felt watched, the sensation unbroken even as I paused to stabilize my equipment. The fog thickened, visibility reduced to a few feet, and instruments recorded spiking electromagnetic activity. Shadows shifted unnaturally. I realized these were not animals. The forms had irregular humanoid outlines, each draped in luminescent fungal filaments. The critical evidence discovery occurred when I backed into a hollowed section of the bog near a fallen tree. Embedded within the fungal growth was what appeared to be human tissue, skeletal remains interlaced with mycelium. Portions of musculature had been replaced entirely by the fungal network, which maintained a pulsing glow. I collected photographs, GPS data, and partial tissue samples using a portable, sterile kit. The complexity of integration suggested a deliberate, slow process. Further analysis in my portable field lab revealed not only mycelial structures, but complex, nerve-like filaments intertwined with mammalian tissue. This indicated that the fungus was capable of integrating and sustaining neural-like networks, effectively weaving flesh into its system. Life-threatening confrontation occurred moments later. While attempting to retreat, the dense fog concealed humanoid forms approaching from multiple directions. The entities were draped in fungal growths, their movement slow but deliberate. A low, collective hum emanated from the area, consistent with vibrational frequencies recorded in prior instrument readings. I became disoriented in the undergrowth. Inhalation of the thick air produced mild vertigo. My equipment, flashlight, and samples were difficult to manage. The entities advanced silently, leaving no discernible path for escape. The realization that these forms were animate, repurposed biological matter was immediate and horrifying. Escape was achieved through a combination of disorientation and calculated retreat. I abandoned my equipment in areas of dense vegetation to lighten my load and retraced my path through previously mapped landmarks. Once outside the central fungal colony, I accelerated toward the lodge. At first light, I drove 30 miles before contacting authorities in a nearby town. I filed an official report, including photographic documentation and GPS coordinates of all collection sites. The aftermath involved immediate institutional fallout. The university revoked my grant and publicly dismissed my findings. Reports to federal environmental and forestry agencies were formally closed without action, with language citing possible observer error. No investigation was launched into the ecological anomalies themselves. I received terse responses, emphasizing compliance with research protocols, without acknowledgement of the evidence collected. The lingering final horror is ongoing. Foggy Bog remains unpatrolled and unmonitored. Remote satellite imagery shows continued luminescent anomalies at night, consistent with fungal activity described in my field notes. Soil samples obtained indirectly through later environmental surveys suggest persistent and unusual chemical signatures. The understanding that the fungal network is capable of restructuring mammalian tissue, combined with the presence of humanoid forms in the deep bog, indicates a living, potentially intelligent ecosystem. There is no evidence to suggest that its activity has ceased. Any individual venturing into the bog could inadvertently become incorporated into the fungal system. I continue to monitor the area from a distance, using satellite imagery, occasional indirect sampling, and remote chemical sensors. The knowledge that the Foggy Bog ecosystem is alive in a manner both alien and predatory remains with me. The academic and governmental denial does not alter the reality of what I witnessed. The entities within the mist, the flesh weavers, exist, and the potential for future encounters, accidental or otherwise, persists. The Whispering Pines of Shadow Creek. I spent most of my adult life turning land into lines. Coordinates, boundaries, elevations, things that behaved according to rules. Even after retirement, my days followed a familiar order. I volunteered a few hours a week tracing historical land claims, correcting old survey errors, and helping local archives reconcile maps that didn't quite agree with each other. It was quiet work, predictable. At 67, predictability felt earned. Shadow Creek entered my life through a family file. While organizing personal papers, I came across a thin folder labeled with my great-great-aunt's name. She had homesteaded somewhere in the Cascades in the early 1900s and vanished in 1910. No grave, no recovery. The land claim had been voided after her disappearance, the property folded back into public holdings. As a cartographer, I noticed something immediately. The legal description of her homestead didn't match any existing plats. The coordinates drifted. The creek name appeared, disappeared, then reappeared decades later on different maps. That inconsistency was the trigger. I began by requesting historical land office records. Most were routine, but Shadow Creek was repeatedly annotated with vague language: unsurveyable, terrain interference, access deferred. Those notes stretched across decades. I cross-referenced them with census data and found something else. Families appeared near Shadow Creek for one census cycle, then vanished from records entirely. No death certificates, no relocation documents. I decided to go myself. The nearest town was Hearthwood Creek, barely large enough to justify a post office. The road narrowed as I approached, paved to gravel, then to packed dirt. Forest closed in from both sides. There were no signs marking Shadow Creek, only a hand-painted board nailed to a tree, weathered enough that the lettering had nearly faded. When I stopped for supplies in Hearthwood Creek, conversation was polite until I mentioned my destination. The woman at the counter paused, then said the valley wasn't suitable for camping. Another man suggested my maps were wrong. No one offered directions. One older resident finally said, "The pines remember who walks under them." He said it as if repeating something he'd been told not to explain. The valley itself felt enclosed. Pines grew taller and closer together than I expected, their branches forming a canopy that kept the light dim even at midday. There was a sound I couldn't place. Not wind, not insects. A low, constant murmur that shifted slightly as I moved. My compass needle wavered. My GPS unit lost signal, briefly locking onto coordinates miles away before correcting itself. I marked that as interference and continued. By late afternoon, I located the remains of a structure where my aunt's cabin should have been. Stone footings, a collapsed chimney. Inside the debris, I found a false panel beneath what would have been the floorboards. Behind it was a journal wrapped in oilcloth and several photographs. The journal entries began normally. Descriptions of clearing land, weather patterns, loneliness. Over time, the tone changed. She wrote about voices in the pines, about paths that seemed to rearrange themselves, about losing track of time. The final entry ended abruptly. "They want me to forget." to leave the path. The photographs disturbed me more. In several, she stood beside what appeared to be her reflection, as if a mirror had been placed outdoors. The figure beside her matched her posture exactly, but the eyes were empty, unfocused. The smile didn't quite align with the rest of the face. That night, I camped near the ruins. The murmuring grew louder after dark. Not words, but something that suggested speech. At intervals, the forest fell completely silent. No insects, no wind. During those moments, I felt watched, though I saw nothing. On the second night, the whispers sharpened. They began using my name. I told myself it was memory, fatigue, suggestion. Still, when I looked up, I saw movement between the trees. Tall shapes, indistinct. One stepped into moonlight. It mirrored me exactly. Same posture, same tilt of the head. Its limbs were too long, its proportions subtly wrong. It did not advance. It simply stood and watched. I felt a pressure, an urge to step toward it, to leave the campsite and follow the voice promising familiarity. I packed without thinking, hands shaking, aware of being observed the entire time. At dawn, I left the valley. When I later presented the journal and photographs to local historians and county officials, the response was uniform. The journal was dismissed as isolation-induced paranoia. The photographs were attributed to early photographic artifacts. A county land officer told me Shadow Creek had always caused paperwork problems and suggested I stop pursuing it. No investigation was opened. The homestead remains unmarked. Shadow Creek is still absent from most modern maps. Sometimes when I review the photographs, I notice something I didn't before. In the reflection's eyes, there is depth, as if it is looking past the camera, waiting. The valley is still there, and it remembers. The Chronal Rift of Eagle Peak. I am Dr. Benjamin Carter. I was 36 years old at the time of the Eagle Peak incident, employed as a junior faculty researcher in applied theoretical physics. My days were predictable. Lectures in the morning, simulation models in the afternoon, grant paperwork at night. I specialized in space-time irregularities, but only in the abstract sense. Equations, probabilities, and theoretical boundaries that were never expected to manifest outside controlled thought experiments. My work was not field-based. I did not hike. I did not camp. I had no practical reason to be in the North Cascades. That changed when a colleague forwarded me a set of satellite anomaly reports flagged by an automated system designed to detect gravitational lensing irregularities. The data came from a sparsely monitored sector near Eagle Peak. At first, I assumed it was a sensor error. That was common. But the anomalies repeated, slight distortions, localized electromagnetic interference, temporal desynchronization between satellites passing over the same coordinates hours apart. The system flagged it 3 times in 1 month. That was not supposed to happen. The trigger that forced escalation came when archival imagery was pulled for comparison. In photographs dating back to the 1950s, there were irregular absences, blurred gaps in terrain continuity. In one image, a fire lookout tower appeared intact. In another, taken days later, it appeared partially collapsed, without any recorded incident. In a third, it was gone entirely. No demolition record existed. I submitted a formal inquiry. It was returned unanswered. 2 weeks later, a representative from a federal research liaison office contacted me privately. He suggested, without committing anything to writing, that I verify environmental causes on site before escalating further. No funding was offered. No formal authorization provided. Just an expectation. Eagle Peak sat far from any maintained trail. The nearest town, Cascade Falls, had fewer than 400 residents. The drive took 6 hours. The last 40 miles were gravel, then dirt, then nothing. Cascade Falls felt suspended in time. Storefronts hadn't changed in decades. The Historical Society occupied a former schoolhouse. Inside, I found photographs of climbing parties from the mid-20th century. Several captions used the same phrasing. Never returned. No cause listed. No investigations referenced. When I asked a volunteer about Eagle Peak, she closed the ledger and told me the exhibits were not for research use. She suggested I speak to the county ranger. The ranger was not available. The climb began before sunrise. The forest absorbed sound quickly. No wind, no birds after the first hour. My instruments began to drift almost immediately. My wristwatch lost 12 seconds, then gained 20. GPS markers lagged behind my actual movement. At approximately 7,800 feet, I experienced my first moment of disorientation, a sense of repetition. I was certain I had passed the same boulder twice, though my elevation indicated otherwise. I marked the location physically. When I looked back later, the mark was gone. By mid-afternoon, the light behaved inconsistently. Shadows elongated without corresponding sun movement. The air carried a metallic taste. My field recorder captured electromagnetic spikes every time I stopped moving. Near the summit ridge, I located the fire lookout. It was not destroyed. It was decayed unevenly. Portions appeared decades old. Others looked newly constructed, as though repaired and abandoned repeatedly. Inside, I found a journal beneath loose floorboards. The ranger's name was Thomas H. Avery. His entries began in 1962, initially procedural, weather notes, wildlife observations, then anomalies, time discrepancies, reports of hearing his own voice calling from the tree line. Entries began contradicting each other, events described before they occurred. The final pages were erratic. Mentions of echoes, of seeing the lookout occupied when he was alone, of losing hours without memory. The last entry ended mid-sentence. Beneath the journal, I found reel-to-reel tapes sealed in a metal box. The recordings were fragmented, voices overlapping. Some were intelligible, others distorted beyond recognition. One voice identified itself as Ben. It described standing at the summit and seeing what comes after. I stopped the playback. That night, I remained inside the lookout. At approximately 2:10 a.m., all ambient noise ceased. No wind, no insects, no structural creaking. My instrument stopped registering time increments entirely. I felt observed. At dawn, I reached the summit. The distortions intensified. My equipment failed sequentially. First the recorder, then the GPS. Finally, my watch stopped. The air in front of me appeared to ripple, as if heat distortion without heat. The rift did not open violently. It simply became visible. It was not a hole. It was a displacement, a section of reality offset from itself. Through it, I observed layered environments. Forests I did not recognize, structures that had not been built, landscapes absent of life. And then I saw myself, older, emaciated, trapped within the distortion. His mouth moved, but no sound emerged. The sensation of his panic registered directly in my mind. The pull began immediately, not physical force but temporal displacement. My body resisted instinctively. I anchored myself to exposed rock and forced myself backward. The image did not follow. It receded. I descended without stopping. When I submitted my findings, the response was immediate and unified. My funding was terminated. My access revoked. A statement was issued citing methodological failure and psychological strain. Eagle Peak was designated a restricted area due to geological instability. The tapes were confiscated. The journal disappeared from inventory. I have not returned, but satellite data still shows anomalies at those coordinates. The rift was not destroyed. It was contained, administratively. What remains unresolved is whether the future version of myself I saw was a projection, a possibility, or a survivor from a timeline already lost. The mountain is still there. The Blackwater Cult of Serpent's Coil. I'm Anya Sharma, 31, a former cult deprogrammer who now operates independently. My work involves helping families reconnect with loved ones who have vanished into fringe groups. I've spent years observing manipulation tactics, studying recruitment patterns, and learning to recognize the psychological levers that keep members compliant. My daily life before this investigation was methodical, reviewing case files, conducting interviews with former members, analyzing patterns across multiple groups. I maintained strict routines to avoid burnout. Mornings spent reading transcripts, afternoons in consultation with families, evenings compiling behavioral analyses. The work is slow, painstaking, and requires constant vigilance. It's an environment of subtle pressure rather than immediate danger. The trigger came in early May 2019, when I received a desperate call from a mother in Portland. Her son, Michael, 19, had become increasingly withdrawn, skipping school and disappearing for days. She had traced his movements to a fringe group known locally as the Children of the Black Water. She was terrified, certain the cult was capable of far worse than mere isolation. Her plea was clear: recover him. The assignment was complicated. The cult was known to operate in extreme secrecy, deeply embedded in the forests surrounding the Umatilla National Forest. Traveling to the region was the first immersion into isolation. Willow Creek, the closest settlement, is a fishing village of no more than 70 residents. The road in is narrow, winding through dense pine and cedar, with minimal signage and patchy cell coverage. Houses are weathered, and the few locals I spoke to offered warnings veiled in fear. The river calls to them, one man muttered, eyes darting to the forest, refusing to elaborate. There was an unspoken agreement. Outsiders do not ask questions, and those who do are met with silence or veiled threats. The physical environment itself reinforced the isolation. Trees towered over the narrow river paths, the dense canopy allowing only dappled sunlight. Mist often lingered low to the ground, making the forest feel like a living barrier. Early irregularities emerged immediately. While speaking to locals about the cult, I noticed subtle signs: fish left uneaten at docks, faintly scorched areas near the riverbank, and small ritualistic markings carved into tree trunks. People spoke of the cult's practices as if they were fact, not rumor. Members were described as unnaturally tranquil, even joyful, despite extreme deprivation. When I first glimpsed a member from a distance, standing still by the water, the physical oddities were evident: skin too pale, eyes unnaturally wide, pupils too black. The warning signs were subtle but persistent, threading unease through otherwise mundane observations. Pattern recognition became crucial as I gathered information. A review of historical files revealed a string of disappearances spanning decades, all linked to Willow Creek. Police reports archived under Missing Persons showed common threads: young men and women vanishing near the river, scant physical evidence, no follow-up. A retired officer told me off the record that these kids just drifted away, no one cared enough to push, implying systemic negligence. Names, dates, and river locations aligned consistently, suggesting long-term planning and concealment. It became clear the cult's footprint extended beyond casual lore into institutional history. The first hard evidence arrived when I infiltrated a remote section of the cult's commune. Disguised as a lost hiker, I located a small, overgrown shack hidden along a tributary of the Serpent's Coil. Inside, I discovered Michael's journal. The entries progressed from hesitation to deep immersion in the cult's philosophy, increasingly focused on the gifts of the deep and truth in the black water. The journal contained ritualistic drawings depicting human figures submerged in dark water, their eyes turning solid black. Hidden compartments revealed jars of viscous black liquid and a series of photographs showing cult members drinking from them, their features subtly distorting. Each artifact confirmed the reports from Willow Creek, demonstrating a tangible link between historical disappearances and current activities. Institutional resistance quickly became apparent. When I contacted local authorities to report the discovery, my calls were deferred, my emails ignored. Officers cited jurisdictional issues and the remoteness of the area. A single sergeant suggested that the cult operated off the radar, but refused to authorize intervention. Attempts to escalate to the state police met with similar delays, and every inquiry seemed mired in bureaucratic red tape. It became evident that either the cult's long-term presence had been normalized, or there was deliberate inaction. Escalation into personal danger occurred during observation of their ritual practices. One evening, I watched a ceremony at a river bend. Cult members, eyes unnaturally black, chanted around a still pool of dark water. Michael approached the center, preparing for full immersion. A shape began to form in the water, humanoid but indistinct, moving with deliberate fluidity. The air carried a heavy, sweet odor, like the black liquid in the jars. I realized immediate confrontation was too dangerous. Surveillance was compromised by dense forest, minimal visibility, and the potential for members to act violently. I knew I had seconds to act if I wanted to extract Michael safely. Critical evidence included Michael's journal, ritual sketches, jars of black liquid, and photographs documenting both participation and alteration. Each artifact provided data on the cult's doctrine and methods. Combined with historical police files, the evidence established a pattern of long-term manipulation and disappearance spanning decades. The life-threatening confrontation occurred as I created a diversion. Using a smoke flare near the ritual site and calling Michael's name, I broke the trance momentarily. Cult members recoiled at the sudden interruption, giving me the opportunity to seize Michael. He resisted initially, conditioned by weeks of indoctrination, but I managed to pull him away from the water's edge. Members pursued, but the dense undergrowth slowed their approach. My escape required precise timing, knowledge of terrain, and rapid extraction to avoid direct confrontation. Escape and intervention ended with us reaching Willow Creek and securing temporary lodging with the supportive local family. Michael was deeply traumatized and physically unwell. His recounting fragmented. I alerted state authorities, and a task force was deployed. Intervention led to the removal of several cult members, seizure of ritual materials, and temporary closure of commune access points. Aftermath and legal fallout were limited. Several arrests were made, but charges were inconsistent due to lack of direct evidence for long-term disappearances. Local authorities, citing procedural limitations, released most individuals pending further investigation. The commune remains under intermittent surveillance. Michael continues therapy and monitoring. Some files remain sealed due to ongoing investigations. The lingering final horror is the knowledge that the cult is still active. Portions of the Serpent's Coil remain unpatrolled, and the water itself continues to serve as both ritual site and symbol of the cult's enduring influence. Historical patterns suggest that disappearances and manipulations are likely to continue. Michael's partial recovery is a relief, but the systemic secrecy, authority in action, and enduring presence of the black water indicate that the threat has not been neutralized. The river calls, and somewhere in its depths the doctrine persists,